This is an overlapped commentary of one of the recent all-boss runs that I performed for Redout 2. The loadout that we're using here is using the Königsworth ship chassis with the PSLN propulsor, SSBR stabilizer, Hurricane rudder, HSKO hull, IS-ES intercooler, and Pi 70 ESC. This is a variation of what's called Roki build in the community, which is considered to be one of the most meta loadouts for going fast in this game, and we use the Königsworth ship chassis over one of the other top chassis called a Sarah or Baran, primarily because later on inside of this run, the stability stat becomes more important. Now, some important concepts as we're starting on Mount Fuji here is there are two different health resources in this game you can think of. You have your actual hull, which is the bottom left blue bar, and your heat, which is the bottom right bar that goes from orange to red and says overheat. Once you overheat, any future boosting that would generate heat then generates health damage instead. And finally, that center item that we just activated on this first detach here on Mount Fuji is called a hyper boost, and that is activated at the 25th second of every single race, and also comes back every 6 to 12 seconds depending on how long you let the hyper boost go on for, and it gives a nice little sound whenever it does activate, as we just activated another one here. Now, we can cancel these hypers early, and canceling them early does not get you as much speed as you normally will get through them, but it does cause it to come back a little faster. One other key component that we're making use of here is what's called boost stacking or double boosting, and it is where you can do both a normal boost, which generates heat on its own, and your hyper boost in order to have a stacked boost effect, which gives you a massive amount of acceleration compared to if you did not. One final concept here is a lot of these double pads is what we call them. There are two boost pads, these little orange things on the track. Sometimes they're purple, sometimes they're green. They sit side by side on the track, and they're close enough that if you hit them right in the middle, you'll actually get the boost off of both of them, and it is really important to make sure you hit as many doubles as possible in whatever boss race you're trying to do. Now, the boss race itself, for every single track in this game, there are 12 main environments, and the boss track essentially takes you through the 3 subdivided tracks within that environment. So what we're starting with here is Mount Fuji, which goes through Rainbow Forest, which we've already completed, Dragon's Gates, which we're now coming towards the end of, and the final track, Path of Wonder. After that, we'll move linearly along the list of how things are presented, and we'll go through all of the DLC, as well as the recently added, I say recently, it's been a year, the Vertex environment as well. So we just started Path of Wonder. With regards to why we care about stability later on for our ship choice at Cohen, the stability is essentially grip in this game. That's how you can think of it, and it concerns with how your ship loses speed. There's a lot of physics simulations that are going on in this game when it's determining how you drift, how you turn, and with stability, it specifically reduces, I'm not sure if reduces is the right word, but it lessens the effect of friction on your vehicle, which allows you to maintain speeds higher than you normally would. So while a Sarah might be the right call for some of these early boss tracks, which don't really need that much stability, for the later track, stability is absolutely necessary to maintain the fastest possible speed through all of these sections of the tracks. Another thing you've noticed us doing throughout the entirety of this is something like this detach off of the surface. Depending on where you are in a certain track, it might be more beneficial for you to detach off of the main track and use whatever airtime you get as a way to skip parts of the track or generate more speed than you otherwise would be able to do. It should be noted that whenever you're in air, you should be boosting, because air resistance is a thing in this game, and if you are not boosting, you will start losing speed. So Cairo is the next track coming up, and while Mount Fuji didn't really have anything interesting beyond just tight, clean racing lines, Old Cairo has more of a heat focus and therefore is a little more sketchy on ensuring you're not overboosting and destroying your ship. So something we're going to see happen very often whenever I'm doing these boosts is I'm going to go right up until the very edge of my hull, and sometimes I manage to get a perfect hull, which is literally just 1 pixel of health remaining. All of these boost patterns are pretty well defined on what I need to do. Whenever I'm doing the first track of each one, Neo Kalima in this instance, I'm trying to do something akin to the time attack pattern for these tracks, but as soon as I swap over to the next track, I'm trying to position myself to be more for the hot lap, that being, lap 2 and beyond for their tracks. So normally I would keep my hyper going through that corkscrew throughout the entire thing, but because I want the hyper back right here, I come into Qasr El Nile, which is the second track, with a lot more speed. That's also the case for how I'm going to end the tracks. Now normally I would also want to then do a hot lap for the final track for these boss races. In this case it'll be on Tahrir. But in those cases, I'm just trying to sprint to the finish, and so I have to do this weird hybrid between swapping between time attacks and swapping between hot lap strategies. And that's kind of the bread and butter of what makes you fast in this. You have to understand when you swap from one strategy and to another, and that requires you to, of course, know what's the fastest strategy for those cases. Some obvious things about this game compared to Redout 1. Redout 2 very much punishes you for hitting walls, whereas Redout 1, there's an entire strata of skill dedicated to this concept called wall bouncing, where by bouncing off the walls in certain ways, you can get better speed while turning your ship. In Redout 2, it's much more important to maintain these clean lines and don't touch a single wall, because touching any wall will massively reduce your speed. Another concept which is harder to pick up is something called counter-strafing. There are technically 6 ways you can move your ship in this game. You have pitch, which is your up and down motion. You have your standard steer, which rotates the ship left and right. And then you have your strafe, which will actually push the ship left or right without changing the direction your ship is trying to move in. What counter-strafing does is if you steer in one direction and you strafe in another, you create the widest line possible throughout a turn. And that sounds like a bad thing if you understand how racing games typically want you to hit things as tight as you can, but in Redout 2 and how the track surfaces are curved, it can sometimes be better to take the outside of certain turns to use the effect of gravity. That will essentially cause what we call slingshots, and it's very obvious when you go into crests, where you gain a bunch of speed by letting gravity assist you throughout the track as the magnets are pulling you into the track itself. What counter-strafing does is it just creates these wider lines for you to take than your ship's turning radius would normally allow for, and you can take certain turns a lot faster or a lot tighter than you'd be able to do otherwise. So we're now moving into the Mars Memorial. Mars doesn't really have any kind of special environmental factor, but it does have a couple of difficult jumps, which is also going to see one of the major applications of the first trick of this run called a roll dive. Now, a roll dive is an advanced technique where you are essentially able to reach a certain surface in a jump way faster than you should be able to do it. Now, every action in this game has inertia. I mentioned before that everything is physics simulated and it's all very in-depth. Everything takes time. An object in motion will stay in motion until you act on it, and that's the case for your ship in this game as well. You have to put energy into your ship. You have to physically turn your vector that represents your ship's forward velocity. The only exception to that is strafing in the air. For some reason, air strafing is the only option in this game which is essentially instantaneous on how it translates your ship's position without affecting your momentum vector or your velocity vector or anything like that. And so we abuse that in a technique called roll diving, whereby essentially rolling such that we're about perpendicular with our landing zone, here's the first example, we can then air strafe towards our landing zone, which allows us to constantly translate our position downwards without changing our forward vector at all. And that's important because by changing the direction of our forward vector, we're having to spend some of our thrust, either by boosting or just by our normal throttle, trying to move our vector downwards, and then we'd of course have to move the vector back to be parallel with the track, and that causes you to lose some non-substantial amounts of speed. We do another extreme one here, where I'm immediately going to roll to the left and start strafing left, which allows me to get down here way faster than I would have otherwise, as I would have overshot the turn had I just kept my normal direction going. What that has essentially allowed us to do is it allowed us to get to a potential landing zone without having to sacrifice any of our forward speed or sacrifice any of our current position relative in the air, and that's massive for many of these tracks which have longer jumps or more complicated or technical jumps that you have to work with. Now, an interesting part of how this game behaves, there's a mantra in Redout 1 called steer less, strafe more, or I think it might be reversed, and that does hold true with Redout 2. The idea is that you'll always go faster if you're just strafing your ship rather than turning it. As I mentioned, strafing is pretty much the only thing that doesn't have any kind of time to act onto it. So steering will cause your ship to lose a little bit of speed as it rotates the nose of the ship to whatever direction you want to go in. In that case, we do want to be strafing more often than not. However, because Redout 2 doesn't have wall bouncing to help it, the steering needs to be a little more involved, and so while I think that some people have preference on whether or not they do strafe or steer, I at least have a preference for steering, because I prefer to be able to just get my ship into a direction and go in that direction. We see another roll dive coming here. This one is kind of tight, touching the bridge of Mars Memorial there, but we end off the final track by exploding and still get a good time. So at this point, we're now moving into what I think is the first hard boss track, that is Tartarus Mines. Now, this is my favorite environment visually, but it is also one of the hardest to do in an all-boss speedrun. Tartarus Mines is very hot. And a lot of heat means that your boost generation, when it creates heat, is going to do so much faster, and it also means that you'll start losing hull faster, since the amount of hull you lose is pretty proportional to the amount of heat you're generating. So starting on Sisyphus here, we are wanting to do a full boost into this turn, and just wait until we hit around this checkpoint before we start boosting again. Another important part about this run, which I haven't really been talking about but is almost pivotal to making sure you get good times, is hull management or boost management. The idea is that you need to know when you can and can't activate your boosting or your hypers to not interrupt your hull regeneration. Your hull only regenerates after about 4 odd seconds of not taking any type of damage that includes heat damage from boosting or hitting a wall hard enough. There is a little bit of leeway, so it's not completely strict on what you can and can't do during that time, but we use that in order to create situations where we have more hull than we would otherwise, and that creates a longer boost duration, which, as you can imagine, is associated with a far faster speed. Another thing to note about sections like that in Sisyphus, where there is a sharp incline upwards, it's basically 90 degrees, is if you're approaching that very fast, you are guaranteed to scrape the nose of your ship onto that track. Even if you're at max pitch, your ship's magnets do not react fast enough, and so you will start losing speed. So for those kinds of sections, we really need to focus on canceling our hyper early or keeping our speed at a certain level that reduces the amount of scraping possible. There's another big example of this later on in the Origin Black Hole track, on specifically its third environment Sputnik, where the starting double loops are very important to not oversend on your hyper because you're going to get slowed down by the loops anyways. One thing about landings that we're seeing here, there are a couple of different types of landings. Ideally, you always want to hit a perfect landing in this game. That gives you a massive boost of speed and helps you retain your speed perfectly. And then you have good landings, which are okay, but obviously they don't give as much of a bonus. And then any other landing is basically irrelevant in the context of this game. That is a very close dodge on the drill, by the way. I never commented about it. With landings, though, there is some, I don't want to say nuance, there can be some lottery associated with landings. There is this one bug that has a couple of different names. I call them weird landings, but it's very colloquially called a landing bug, where if you're hitting a jump at too weird of an angle, or you're coming in with too much speed into a jump, the collision of your ship can kind of hiccup, essentially, when it hits the ground. And now, they kind of fixed that in the last update, where your ship no longer loses its regen for that happening. But what it does do is it causes your ship's momentum to essentially flatline for a second. And for world record runs specifically, it's almost a death sentence to have a landing bug occur. During this run, I think there are a couple of moments where I landing bug, but given that the all-boss speedrun is more of a test of endurance rather than strictly execution, it is okay for it to happen a couple of times. I wasn't too moved. But if you're ever looking to spot when a landing bug happens, whenever I'm in a jump, if you see my speed drop by like 400 or more kilometers an hour, then you know that I'm probably landing bugged. Now we're on Tantalus, the final track of Tartarus. This is also one of the first longer boss tracks. With Tantalus, there are a couple of tricks we can perform, but I elect to only do this crossover, or I guess this pair of crossovers, in the cave section, since that's what I've become comfortable with in making sure my speed remains high. There are some other tricks associated with the previous tracks, like Sisyphus and Ixion, but I think overall it's more important to play it safe in an all-boss run. Any death you take in this game, which obviously occurs whenever you hit something or you lose all of your health, that is going to set you back at least 2 seconds. And in the context of Redout, 2 seconds is a massive amount of time, which is why I found it very obvious that a 44-second improvement over my previous all-boss run is probably pretty noteworthy. We're coming up to the end of Tartarus here. We can kind of see an example of a crest giving us a slight slingshot there. I cancelled my hyper early specifically so I could use the crest to maintain my speed high, and that also means that my hyper comes back online right here during this straight, which is better for us overall to maintain our speed until we hit the finish line. And that's the end of Tartarus Mines. So there are some slight mistakes. My current best on Tartarus Mine is closer to a 452, though I am trying to get the first sub 450. We're now moving to the Mariana Trench, which I think in terms of races is actually my favorite environment. The benefit with this track is that everything, or I guess almost everything, is underwater. And underwater means that your ship's cooling rate is increased, though you do have slightly increased drag, which is a little esoteric on what that actually means, but I think it means that you lose speed from friction. As a result, that means stability isn't as important here. On Tartarus Mine, stability is king. It is the best stat in the game there, and so we've already had one example where Cohen would absolutely destroy Acera in terms of ship chassis, though I think here Acera definitely handily has Noreus in the bag. We see an example here of me maintaining my boost as long as I'm in the air. Once we get through this S-bend and onto this cave section, I'm trying to boost as long as I can without interrupting my regen, because again, we don't want to lose speed in the air. This is one of the most important sections of Noreus. We need to cancel our hyper early to have enough duration to boost through the entirety of this crest, because by doing so we'll have a gravity-assisted slingshot happen for the entirety of the maneuver, and that can get you top speeds of up to 2400 if you're feeling really great, although I only managed 2200 there. This is an example where I'm using counter-strafing intermittently, where I'm doing both just strafing with my turn and strafing against my turn in order to keep my line pretty stable or mark where I want to go within those turns. Some crests like that one actually have what I can only describe as speed limits. This game, obviously, I'm moving very fast in this game, but there are certain sections of the track where the magnets that keep your ship attached to the track simply just fail. There are more egregious examples of this. For example, there's one black hole track, Voyager, it's the first one, where there is a speed limit of about 3200 kmh there. If you exceed that, you will detach off of the main crest of Voyager, and you will instantly fly into the black hole, which destroys your ship. And in cases like this, a lot of these crests, where I'm coming in with a ton of speed off of a hyper, I do have to somewhat feather myself a bit, which is just tapping the brake or letting off the accelerator, in order to reduce my speed below those speed limits. Some of them are very easy, some of them you don't have to think about, but some of them can and will make or break runs. It's definitely more common on the reverse tracks in this game, but since this isn't all forwards, it's a little bit nicer. Another effect that we haven't really touched upon is terrain types. Most of the game is either track or just open air, or water in this case, and that behaves pretty much the baseline of how these ships will all drive, but there are two other types of main track type, I guess is how I would describe it. There's one called terrain, which we saw a bunch of in Cairo and a bunch of in Mars Memorial, as well as just a little bit of Mount Fuji. where terrain will reduce the rate that your heat dissipates, but it will increase your grip on the surface. Then there's another type where on water, like we saw on the second track there of Ati, you'll have an increased cooling rate, but you'll have a decreased grip on the surface. Now for a straightaway like that on Ati, that of course doesn't really matter, we're already moving straight, but for other sections, which I think is going to include Caribbean Dam later, it'll be a little more important on making sure you can keep your ship properly strafing or properly turning as you need to. Now, something you may have noticed in many of the jumps that we've already performed, including that one just now on Nuliajuk, is not every jump requires you to hit intermittent platforms, and that's an important factor. Again, you can move really fast in the air. You always want to be boosting in the air, but the thing that I didn't mention about being in the air is that there is no speed cap in the air. Once you're in the air and you are boosting, you will keep gaining speed until you hit a track surface. Tracks have, I'm not sure if it's something to do with the friction or if it's something related to the top speed of the ship stat, but there is kind of this upper limit where it's very hard to gain more speed without assistance on tracks. But as long as you're boosting in the air, you will keep generating more and more speed until you hit a track surface. And that's a case of there on Nuliajuk, where I was staying in the air by skipping those platforms, which gave me a lot more speed heading into that little half-pipe section. It's going to be a little more obvious as we move to Cloud Ocean here. Cloud Ocean's main gimmick is that there are a lot of track surfaces with no walls, but there are also a lot of jumps. And so while this track is very fun for a racing environment, this is one of the worst tracks in the boss speedrun. This is the track which has killed my runs the most, and it's usually because of the second or third track of Lebecchio and Mistral. So I do want to talk about Cloud Ocean here, because this is a difficult one. With Cloud Ocean, there are a lot of union of ideas. There's a lot of things that I've talked about that you have to pay attention to on Cloud Ocean, and specifically is roll diving. So this right here, this jump, is the one where roll diving became popular because hitting this intermittent platform and then into this inverted crest gave you an absurd amount of speed. And we found that during one of our things called a 7-day challenge, which allowed us to essentially bring the aura time on Cloud Ocean from 1 minute 17 all the way to, I think it's a 1 minute 14 right now. That being said, Cloud Ocean really popularized roll diving and improved air control as we know it, and I feel like it's been obvious at this point, there are a lot of fast jumps where you are instantly going into some kind of turn or complicated maneuver. I think it should be somewhat obvious that Cloud Ocean is definitely one of the harder tracks. Very unassuming, very difficult. Here's another example where I'm actually using roll dive to go down faster. There is a kill wall at the end near where that waterfall is, and if you touch that, of course, a kill wall does exactly what you think it would, and we would have to respawn. So we have to go down a little bit faster, but I don't want to use pitch because that would reduce all the speed I'm coming in with, so we use a roll dive to get down to the surface faster. Now, Lebecchio is problematic not because it has a lot of roll dives, though it does have some, specifically this one coming up here. It's because it has a lot of detaches or a lot of tricks you can perform. It's faster to stay on the top path of Lebecchio here, but because of the height of this section of the track, approaching the bottom of this right split is kind of prone to landing bugs, and I do actually get a landing bug there, which kind of sucks, which we then need to lead into getting our hyper back at a very specific time. So now we're coming up onto a split path, which I'm going to skip completely with a hyper. And this jump is also a bane of my existence type of jump. That has ended many a runs itself. There is also another trick you can do related to this loop right here, where you essentially throw yourself off the right side, but because I was already on a good pace, I didn't want to risk it, so I did a safer strat where I just take the track as normal, which can be fast, but I did hit a wall, so it would have been way slower than just taking the detach. Here's another example where the roll dive is very important. This is an evil jump to do normally. You'd have to pitch down so hard, but with an aggressive roll dive I can maintain this 2,700 into Mistral's first left turn, and that's very massive for getting a good time on the boss race. Mistral's probably the easiest part of Cloud Ocean. I say that with some degree of hesitancy there. But that's because Mistral is very simple by comparison. There's not a whole lot of tricks to do with Mistral, it's just play well. Now, I do almost overshoot that part of the turn, which had me a little bit scared. And then I start dancing to the music, because the OST in this game is great. But it's this section coming up. This is one of the fastest sections in the game, which is very nice and all that, but it's also pretty much a blind jump straight down, where you need to try and hit this section of the track on its apex of the crest, and then you need to maintain all of the speed going through the entire section. I thankfully don't landing bug at all and maintain a full speed through Mistral, which was very nice, and then we just hyper through the right turn to end the run there. So that's Cloud Ocean, and that's one of the hardest gatekeepers of this run out of the way, so I'm already feeling a lot better at this point, but now it's only going to get harder in different ways. Cloud Ocean is really the great filter on whether or not you're allowed to go any further in this run. So Neo Tokyo, I can't say I like Neo Tokyo. Neo Tokyo is probably my least favorite of the tracks. It's either that or Old Cairo. And it's mainly because Neo Kalima, or not Neo Kalima really, but it is problem present in Neo Kalima. I don't like tracks that force me to slow down a lot, or things that are just technical with no way to untechnical it, if that makes sense. Neo Tokyo is a very dense populated city, and so a lot of its tracks are very reminiscent of closed circuits, things you'd find in like a Forza game or a Gran Turismo game. And while I think it creates a cool environment, it can sometimes be a little obnoxious to play around. For the all boss at least, it does mean that Neo Tokyo is one of the more consistent tracks. You don't really have to worry about it too much, just keep your line straight and you'll have a good time. There's not a lot of tricks you have to perform, although there is one evil jump on the second track, which we're coming up on here, Neo Shibuya, which I think is probably the most evil jump in this game. We'll talk about it once we get there. But with other tracks, I'm so used to just going fast, I'm not usually having to do massive slowdowns. But on Neo Tokyo, there's a lot of these situations where you go into a jump, or you go into a turn that is so tight, you need to slow down. And some people vibe with that, I simply don't. I just find it a little, I think it kills the pace of the run, essentially. I'm bonking a lot on Neo Shibuya, and I get a little frustrated here. After all of that, after all of these great times I was posting with the other bosses, I didn't want to lose it on Neo Tokyo being very bad. So, I'm glad I finally got my stuff together at this point and stopped making too many mistakes. Here we see examples of split paths as well. Every single track, well not every single, but every single environment has some sections where there are split paths in what track you can take. And you'd think most of the tracks would probably be pretty similar in their split paths, but that's usually not the case. And so in addition to making sure you know the boost pattern for every track, managing your hull for every track, making sure you remember how to do every track, remembering when you have to swap between each different boost strategy for each track, you also have to contend with remembering which path to go and how you have to hit that pathway. And it just makes this run very mentally demanding, especially if you sit down for a long time and you start grinding out attempts. So speaking of other things with this run, this game's soundtrack is fantastic. I love it. But it does contain a lot of copyrighted soundtracks, which for a speedrun submission at a charity event, you can get around this by running streamer mode instead, which disables some of the copyrighted music tracks. Specifically, it's a lot of the boss tracks. Though I do miss some of the music tracks when streamer mode is on, though it is a thing you can do if you want to give this a shot for a charity event. So now, we're coming into the longest boss in the game, and that is Genesis. Now, Genesis is set on the moon, and it's kind of an extension of the moon from the first game of Redout 1, but everything has gone horribly wrong. And it really reflects in its tracks as well. This is a brutal environment. In my previous all-boss run, Genesis nearly ended the run, And that's primarily because Genesis has a lot of challenging tricks, and it has even more challenging track segments that are completely intentional. So starting with Lunar City, there are two major cuts or detaches we're going to utilize, one of which is going to skip between two different towers, coming up right here, where I'm essentially going to strafe off the right side and roll towards the track segment that I just left, and that skips just a little bit of track segment that we don't want to deal with. You can see sections like that one, that turn specifically, where I'm trying to stay on the outside, especially if it curves drastically inwards, because that creates the situations that's perfect for a gravity-assisted slingshot to occur. These are just very challenging sections of Lunar City. There's a lot of very tight S-bends, which I know I just said, Neo Tokyo, I don't like having to slow down. Genesis, you don't have to slow down, but it's gonna hurt a lot if you don't. This S-bend in particular is something I was very glad to get very nicely, which leads into our second detach here, which you can see a pretty massive landing bug happen there. If you land too close to the side of a track, it can also sometimes landing bug you, but it's a lot more aggressive in that situation. It's like it thought you hit the wall or something, and so it kills all of your speed. This Lunar City run could have definitely been maybe 2 seconds faster had that not happened. And this is the final detach. This one isn't really considered a cut since it's done so frequently, but it just skips a slight bit of turning you might have to do. You can see more concepts of always boosting whenever we're in the air. That includes just slight bumps to our regen, unless it's absolutely pivotal that we need our regen. And now we're on quite possibly my least favorite track in this game. This is Kane's Flats. This starts in the dome, which I think is kind of... the dome section is fine. I think this 90-degree jump can be a little awkward, but otherwise it's an okay section. But Kane's Flats has some of the worst technical sections in this game, which can and will end my runs. This is the first one, coming up down here. This S-bend, I nearly fall off the track because of having to strafe left so drastically on that section, and that could have ended the run right there. So it's a very challenging drop down to maintain your speed through. Here comes the first major jump of Kane's, where I'm trying to land right before the first set of loose pads there. I kind of undershoot it a bit, but if I got too close, I would then hit the kill wall instead, so perhaps it was better. This is another challenging section. We want to aim for the top right pathway, though I'm typically used to taking the middle right pathway, though it is faster to take the top right, as has been demonstrated by many of the people I play with in multiplayer. Technically for here you want to take the rightmost path, but again I'm doing something that just feels more natural to me and taking this left split, because it allows me to do some cool tricks by jumping off the side of the track. You can be very flashy with this game while still being very fast, and that's one aspect that I love about it. Now, this final section of Kane's is shared with the final track of Genesis called Neuman's Outpost, and the top path is unequivocally the faster path, but it's also one of the hardest things to hit in this game, because you cannot see where your ship is going, and you have to land essentially flush with that top section there to maintain about 3,000 kmh throughout the entire straight here. I didn't get a great landing on it, but I did. I got a great landing, but I wanted to get a perfect landing bonus to maintain my speed for higher. That way I could have potentially done an extra detach, where at the end of that you can detach your ship upwards to get an early landing, though if you don't have the speed, there's no reason to. I also won't do this during Neuman's Outpost, but it is something to at least know. Neuman's also has some challenging sections, like this detach here can screw people up. I find it's alright. I can do it pretty well as long as I turn my ship properly, and that leads to me getting my hyper back right at this right turn here, which is needed for their first hyper section. A challenging part of this triple jump section is this S-bend to the right. You ideally want to maintain about 1700 kmh through that turn. I only maintained 400 there because I did have a slight wall bonk on the right, though it's a lot easier if you're running a high stability ship, which is also another reason that Cohen is probably better than a Sarah here. On very specific sections of this track, you will have stability matter more than thrust will, and I think For a while, the world records on most of these tracks were stability based, except for Baran or Acera in very specific cases, although I think now the meta is shifting to be Acera focused for Genesis, though I know Lunar City definitely is still a Cohen focus. So now we're coming up onto the end of Genesis, this long 5.5 minute gauntlet. And we're going to have to do this top path, bottom path jump again. Again, we're going to shoot for the top path. The way I do this is I shoot high, and then if I've overshot, I do a roll dive towards the track to help me correct. That's another benefit of roll diving, is you can also use it to just enhance how you fly, rather than just being a tool to go fast. So now we're going to probably the coolest track in the game, the Origin Black Hole. I've talked about it a little bit during this commentary, specifically on its tracks Voyager and Sputnik. Black Hole is absolutely Cohen favored. Black Hole is a stability playground. Stability is so important in Black Hole. Every single record set on Black Hole has been stability. To start with, on Voyager, we're going to use some recent developments on Voyager and take a right split instead of a left split here, because that allows us to essentially use this track section as a jump off point for a full boost into the double jumps here. So now we're coming into a left. It's kind of optional whether or not you do a mini hyper here, which is a hyper that you cancel right away. I choose to because I have the speed to do so. And now we're coming up to a massive slingshot on Voyager, and this is where there is a speed limit. I need to watch my speed and stop my hyper right before I hit 3200, because if I exceeded 3200 at any point, I would have detached and immediately crashed. And that's the end of Voyager. That's one of the first checkpoints of Black Hole finished, and now we're moving on to Cassini. Now, Cassini doesn't really have any sections that I struggle with, at least. However, it does have some interesting points where you need to slingshot your ship around, and I think those are important to discuss. Right here, I tried to land on the left side of the jump. Unfortunately, I do hit some walls, which reduces my ability to slingshot into this turret. But if you do that properly, you'll be able to maintain easily over 2700 kmh throughout that entire section. We then have this first slingshot here where I do a mini hyper over the crest to give me a huge burst of speed coming into these triple loops. Now during the loops themselves, I'm not boosting, because if I was boosting I would start scraping more, which could reduce my hull, but as soon as I come out of this third one, I do a hyper into this long corkscrew with no walls, mind you, and then try to lay on the left side of the corkscrew to allow me an easier kind of slingshot through the turn and into that jump there. But this section, this always gives me a little bit of anxiety, doing this right turn where the left wall is completely exposed, but I think I've gotten good enough at it to not have to worry too much. I'm going to cancel my hyper here right when I hit the double pads, because I want my hyper back during the kind of very slight chicanes coming up at the end of Cassini, because that means I can be hypering for longer during the end straight of Cassini into Sputnik, which is now the last track of Black Hole, which we are hitting right about now. So now Sputnik is the longest track in Black Hole, and it definitely shows it as being one of the hardest as well. These are those double loops I was talking about near the beginning, where I am no longer boosting, because this scraping is going to be mandatory regardless of how well I want to boost through that section. Now Sputnik is a challenging track because it's not quite just about your boost pattern, it's about your speed management as well, which is why stability is so important for Sputnik. You need to maintain your speed through these sections, because if you hit walls, you lose so much speed, and you need to keep that boost going. You need to keep that speed always up in order to hit Sputnik as a good time. I think the world record for Sputnik right now is about a 1 minute 35 second, and I think my best as of this recording is just barely a 1 minute 39. It is a challenging track, and it is definitely not one that I am favored on, but it is at least one that I know how to do. And that's really the important part of the boss tracks. The all-boss speedrun isn't really testing you to know how to speedrun every track in the game. It's just a massive test of how well can you do every track in the game, just back to back. And that's why it's an endurance test. It's a nearly 50-minute gauntlet of every track in this game, of every trick you know in this game. And it is exhausting, but I gotta admit, it's very fun to watch. You get to see all of the slight tricks, all the slight variations people do and how they drive their tracks. You can see how things are different from Time Attack versus a hot lap. It's all very interesting from the perspective of somebody who loves this game way too much. So now we've ended with most of what's in the base game. So now we're moving into the DLC, starting with Caribbean Dam. Now, Caribbean Dam is something I would consider to be very punishing as a track. You wouldn't think that Caribbean would be punishing. It looks very all nice and happy and whatnot, tropical crabs and all of that. But hitting any wall here in Caribbean Dam is a massive speed loss, because it's just like Origin Black Hole in all the worst ways. It is about speed retention. It is about landing properly. And unlike Black Hole, which had zero gravity, or at least a singularity to give you a very constant and predictable pull, this is Earth gravity, meaning landing bugs here are very common and they are frustrating. Which, as you can see, I just hit one there. Now, Blue Laguna is probably the easiest of the set. It's the most simple to work around. Very predictable hypers, very predictable spots, not too much in the way of tricks, though there are some very brutal jumps at the end here. So that crossover being one, and I managed to clip the barrier, which kind of interrupts my regen, which sucks, but it's not strictly necessary. This jump, on the other hand, is awful. You need to hit that topmost platform to slingshot off the surface and get a boost off of it, and then you need to roll dive back down to the right pathway, which is not very intuitive, mind you, in a very tight time window. You cannot afford to do that any differently, otherwise you might crash into one of the rings, or you'll just overshoot in general and hit a kill wall on the other side of the dam. But now that Blue Laguna is done, we can move to Caldera, which is arguably worse somehow. Caldera is about speed management. It is one of the most blisteringly fast tracks in this game, and it's one of the hardest to do it. I used to be very scared of Caldera until I finally understood how Caldera is meant to be driven. This starting part isn't too complicated, but as soon as we get to this hyper coming up, this track opens up massively. So let's talk about what's happening here. This hyper needs to be cancelled right when I hit the first or second set of pads in order to do a very tight roll onto the top left path. I then need to do a detach off to the right to go to the faster path. By this point, my hyper needs to be back online when I hit these pads, and my hull needs to be full. I need to start a hyper, carefully transition myself through the S-bend entrance, cancel the hyper as I hit the double pads, and keep my boost going until I hit this landing. By this point, I need to boost while I'm in the air, and as soon as my hyper comes back, punch it, and take one of the hardest right turns in this game that's described as a left by the game. And all of that was just to maintain the fastest speed possible through Caldera. And it is awful. But doing it right, you maintain about 2,000 kilometers an hour for the entire duration of that segment, and it is intoxicating to do right. So we're moving to the final track of the Caribbean Dam at this point, and it's actually my favorite, Tropical Twister. Though Tropical Twister does have a couple of sections which can be obnoxious for a speedrun purpose. The first of which is its very first detach, which we're going to perform off a crest coming up. We're going to shoot for a detached segment of the track, which has a couple of landing bonuses associated right now. We need to land towards our right and then roll to the other direction to land on the corresponding track piece, but doing that gives us 2 landing bonuses, which is a massive boost of speed compared to if we just kept the path we were already going. The next major jump here comes after this terrain section off the off-road, where we're going to go into where this track gets its namesake Tropical Twister from. We need to hyper early into this corkscrew. Unfortunately, I hit a wall which breaks my hyper here. I normally should keep my hyper going until I hit those double pads right before this section, and then you can maintain the entirety of this twisting kind of half-pipe section at easily over 2400 kmh. Unfortunately, I didn't do that here, but it was already 40 or so minutes into the run. I was already feeling exhausted, so it's understandable that I start making very minor mistakes. All that's important is that I do not crash, and that's basically the entire mantra of this run. Do not crash, do as fast as you can. towards the ending for all of these sections, they all share this kind of Dolphin Shoals ending where you need to land on the sand or on the track section itself, and those are actually quite challenging, and I was very excited to find out that I landed all 3 of them with no issue and didn't hit any walls during the section, which is massive for making sure you retain your speed through the Caribbean Dam. Now in the old patch, the next track would have been the last one, Terra Roops. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, there was an update to this game, and so now the last track is actually Vertex, which is awful because I'm not good at Vertex. But for now, let's talk about Terra Roops. Terra Roops is like Mariana Trench. It has a lot of cold sections, meaning you can boost for quite a long time in Terra Roops compared to anywhere else. But Terra Roops also has pretty insane segments of speed retention, or otherwise just challenging parts to it. I don't think it's as bad as Caribbean, although if you want to go fast, it definitely has some obnoxious points during the run. Coming up on the initial jump here, you do actually want to hit all of these boost pads. There's not a whole lot of reason to skip them out over trying to go faster on a turn, but this jump, you're trying to land right inside of that checkpoint circle and cancel your hyper on the same point you do that, but it's very difficult because there's a kill wall that is of course right behind that checkpoint, so if you overshoot even slightly, you're going to go respawn. On this section, we have a very tight left loop to take while essentially boosting the whole time. If I was a little better about when I started the hyper, I could have also performed a detach over the crest there, which saves a little bit of time as long as you can boost through it. There's this section on the right where you need to slow down massively in order to not hit that left barrier. Unfortunately, I hit the right barrier anyway, so I definitely felt like a dunce. And this section is one where you want to start it after you exit the high heat sections, which is kind of given by your corners turning red. Like right now we're in the cold section, so the corners are blue. After we get out of the heat zone, we want to activate our hyper so we can get a full duration boost through that entire section, which is important for all of the Terra Roops tracks, though they all do it in slightly different ways. Now Crypto Flame is my favorite of the Terra Roops tracks, and that's primarily because Crypto Flame doesn't require me to have a degree in esoteric speed retention. It's just nice and easy with what it asks me to do. One of the harder parts is coming up right here where we need to do a 90-degree jump and try to land a little bit before that circular ring and try to keep our ship centered so we hit all of our double pads as we go into what we call pizza section, which is just driving on straight lava, which I must say is awesome, and that's one of the set pieces I love in this game. I do a small mini hyper right before I enter this kind of lava-ish temple. I'm not quite sure what it's referred to as inside of the game, and that allows me to get my hyper back right as I'm about to come up this 90-degree section, which is shared by Stranded and Crypto Flame. And then we're going to come across this kind of rowdy-ass bend again, leading into that final straight that Stranded started with, and then we're going to apply the same concept there where we want to hyper after the heat section, so we keep our hold throughout the whole thing. And now we're coming into the last track of Terra Roops, which is Maidens of Karyai. This is one of the most technical tracks, but I wouldn't say it's one of the hardest tracks. It's just, it has a lot of turns, and doing the track without hitting walls can be a little bit difficult. So it starts with a very long straight into a double spiral downwards. I'm going to hyper into the spiral because I need to do a mini hyper essentially to maintain my speed through the upcoming S-bends. And during this kind of corkscrew through the ice, I'm waiting for my hyper and hold to regenerate so I can then do a hyper section over the top of the lava bed over here. I cancel my hyper early and stop boosting just a tad to allow myself to take that very steep incline correctly. Again, we don't want to go too fast because that can cause problems with scraping. But there's also a second side effect where if you go even faster than that, you might actually have your nose intersect with the track and be violently ejected from the track, so that's just another thing to keep in mind. You can see a lot of these very tight turns as the grip is changing sometimes between not cold and cold, which affects how your ship turns. It can make these sections very challenging to do, but as long as you keep like a fairly competent speed throughout the whole thing, you should be fine. Now I do make a slight mistake here and I start my hyper just a little bit too early. although it seems like I was managing to save it throughout the whole duration, and we can see another example of a roll dive here to keep my trajectory correct as I'm coming into the end of Terror Loops here. And so now, we are on the final track of the run, and by this point my heart was pumping, because I had been trying this for the past 5 hours as a session, and this was the first one that reached Vertex. So Vertex is not my strongest track, but it has some interesting jump techs that you have to do to maintain your speed in Vertex. So we start with finger bites. The thing with finger bites is you need to stop our boost kind of early because we want to regenerate just a tad before we start boosting again, and the reason we do that is so we can keep a higher duration coming through these crests and these jumps, which, if you're paying attention to our speed in the bottom left there, is helping us maintain a very high speed up until when our boost has to cease. Since our hull will then regenerate by the point we need it anyways, it doesn't affect us to then have to do a mini hyper here, which is the normal strategy for finger bites. We're now going to do our first trick for finger bites, where I'm going to detach off of the right side of the track coming up instead of taking the jump, with the aim to land on the loop. So I get the detach, I need to cancel my hyper early, and I land on the loop with only a minor loss of speed from the landing, which is good. I can then keep my speed going, maintaining up to 2700, and then my hyper comes back for a mini right as we get to these up and down hills. You can do a slight detach off of this section coming into the spiral, but I actually question whether that's faster or not if you don't have the hull, and ideally you shouldn't have the hull anyways. So we're coming up with a challenging S-bend to finish finger bites, and now we're on Data Miner. Now Data Miner has a couple of tricks of its own, but I broadly consider it to be the easiest of the three. You can do a slight detach on the right here to save just a couple of microseconds really, before you then lead into this massive hyper across the dirt straight, which is going to lead into a left that you kind of have to drift into. Now there are a couple of detach opportunities inside of Data Miner itself, although we're not going to perform too many of them since they tend to be slower, although they're a lot flashier. I pop a mini hyper here and try to keep my boost going throughout the entirety of the loop, which I think is a slight mistake on how I should be doing it. I want to be boosting for this entire jump, but at least I do get my hyper back at this point to do a mini hyper across this dirt straight, which is better overall for me. It's very important that I let myself regenerate because there's a big hyper coming up, so I don't cut into my hull when I do this boost in the air, but as soon as I round this corner, it's time to hyper, and I position myself to the right because I'm trying to sling myself into the left. Unfortunately, I hit the inside wall of this turn and lose a massive amount of speed. You can see I'm a little upset about it. Ideally, we're able to sling ourselves through that turn at full speed coming into the Martian loops over here. Now, an important part about this is we're going to wait to start our hyper until we get closer to our exit of Data Miner, and that's because we're about to rocket into Digithunder with an absurd amount of speed. And the goal is to try to hit as many of the double pads as we can here to keep our speed well above 2k, and it looks like we do hit most of the pads here, which was good for us overall. So now we're coming into our first hyper on Digithunder. I'm going to execute a very aggressive roll dive downwards, because it is not good to stay in the air. Our hyper is now back, so we do a mini hyper, stopping right when we pass this checkpoint. And you could do a roll dive here on this section of the track, but I don't think it's that important to do. Unfortunately, I hit the left turn coming into this, so my regen is a little stunted. Normally I should have more health than I do coming into this hyper, which can affect me right here on this turn. You see I go from 1900 to 1200 kilometers an hour, and that's extremely bad for speed retention, of course. But we're coming to the final section of the track, so we pop one last hyper, we do a slight pitch downward instead of a roll dive, and then we just need to maintain our speed through the straight before the run is finally over. And that was Redout 2, all bosses done in just over 47 minutes. If you have more questions, there is a community Discord for Redout, discord.gg/Redout, where you can contact me if you need more explanation or you want to learn more tricks about this game. Thank you for watching.